So it's my great pleasure to welcome composer, pianist, music educator Bill Dobbins here in Vienna, back again. So it's a great honor to have you here again. Hi, Bill.
It's great to be here, Marcus. Thanks for inviting me back, and it's especially great to be here to hear the premiere of the winning composition of the Spheres of Genius composition contest.
Actually, we're just waiting to go there.
That's right. That's later this evening.
So, Bill, you started your career also in the fields of classical music. You played the music of Pierre Boulez, Lucas Voss. But of course, most people know you as a jazz artist, as a pianist, as a composer, as the head of music departments in Europe, but also in America, and as the director of the WDR big band. But going back to the very first roots, how did everything start? How did you come in contact with music as a child, as a teenager? How did it come that you became a professional musician?
Well, my parents were traveling as in evangelistic work. My father was a Pentecostal minister, and so the first 2 years that I was alive, I spent at his mother's home. And one of my aunts, the younger of my two aunts, was about 14 years old at the time, and she played piano. They had an upright piano in the house, so she played popular songs and hymn tunes and some simple classical music. And my grandmother told me that from the time I was strong enough to sit up on the couch, that I would just listen to my aunt play the piano by the hour, and whenever the piano would stop, I would be looking around like, when's it going to start up again? And so when I was about 4, I think I started to pester my parents into trying to get a piano, which they were relatively poor, so that was a big investment, and it took me 5 years of arguing. So finally, when I was 9, they got an upright piano in the house and found me a neighborhood teacher. And then when I was 13, after studying with a couple of neighborhood teachers, I auditioned for one of the piano professors at the University of Akron at the Firestone Conservatory there. And Akron, Ohio, that's where I grew up. And he took me on as a student, so until I began college studies in 1964, I took lessons from him and worked primarily on classical repertoire, mostly the traditional kind of things, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, some impressionistic music, some early 20th century music like the Kabalevsky preludes and some simple Prokofiev pieces, things like that. And one day when I was at a friend's house, I think I was about 15 at the time in high school, he was not a musician, but we went over to his house one day after school, and his father was a jazz fan, and he had a really great record collection. So while I was there, my friend played me an Ahmad Jamal trio record with Vernel Fournier and Israel Crosby, and then he played me the famous Errol Garner Concert by the Sea record, and then a couple recordings of the Modern Jazz Quartet, and a couple things from Dave Brubeck. This was right at the time when the Time Out record came out with Take 5, Paul Desmond's famous 5/4 jazz composition. And there was a record just before that that's actually still one of my favorites called Gone with the Wind, with that same famous quartet with Paul Desmond and Gene Wright and Joe Morello, where they play songs associated with the South, like Gone with the Wind, Georgia on My Mind, and so on. And I could tell when the thing about classical music that I think most interested me, other than thematic development and the formal aspect of it, was chromatic harmony. I just loved chromaticism, everything from the more chromatic works of Bach to the late Romantic composers and early 20th century composers that still had some contact with tonality. So as soon as I heard these jazz records, I realized that they were playing some theme. Some of them I recognized at the beginning and the end, and I could tell that what they did in the middle had to do with the chord progressions of the opening theme. But I was completely mystified as to how they did that. So from that point on, my main mission in life was to figure out, how do these jazz musicians carry on this spontaneous conversation with all this musical stuff that I love to listen to? So I started trying to figure out solos from records, and I took some theory and harmony lessons from a organist, a church organist in the area who played organ at one of the Presbyterian churches. So I got to play some of the simpler organ pieces of Bach and some other organ composers, but then also started to learn a little more theory and harmony so that I could analyze more clearly and in a way that I understood what was going on in some of the music that I was playing. And then I started trying to compose a little and arrange a little and put together a jazz quartet with a alto saxophonist and a bassist and drummer that were in the high school. It was mostly just for rehearsals, but we did get the occasional gig, and that's where it all started. Then I, again, because my parents were relatively poor, and I decided to just go to a local state university, Kent State, which is not far from Akron. And they had a music department, but at that time, this was in the fall of 1964, none of the music schools, with the exception of the very first pioneer jazz schools like North Texas State and Berkeley and
jazz division.
Some of those, most of the music schools didn't want to have anything to do with jazz. So in our case, I was a double major there in classical piano and classical composition. But there were a bunch of people, a bunch of students that started the same time that I did that wanted to have a big band. And in spite of opposition from the faculty and administration, a lot of hard things that we went through, we made it work. And interestingly enough, some of those people in the band, especially people in the trombone section, ended up making really nice musical careers for themselves here in Europe. The bass trombonist, who was my best friend in college, Roy Duvall, ended up playing in bass trombone in the radio band here in Vienna, and then when it disbanded, he ended up getting the bass trombone job eventually in the WDR band in Cologne. So it was kind of ironic and funny that when I became the director there in 1994, he was still the bass trombonist in the band. So there we were again in a big band, only now it was on a whole different level. And another close friend who's here in Vienna I'm going to be visiting with later on this week with him and his wife, Bob Dodge, also was in the RF big band and stayed in.
Also teacher at the conservatory.
So I was involved in the conservatory here. And actually Bob was one of the, when my wife Darlene and I got married in January of '66. We've been married now for 52 years. Because we were too young to get married without our parents' permission in the state of Ohio. I was 18 and Darlene had just turned 20. We got two of our buddies in the big band, one of whom was Bob Dodge, to drive us to a small town in Michigan where the legal age for a marriage was 18.
So she's a little bit older than you. This is a very modern approach.
Yes, it is. Yeah, she's a little over, more than a year and a half older than me. So, but that's how it started. And when the band got good enough that we felt like we could hire an internationally known soloist to play with us at a concert, the first person we picked was Clark Terry, and he was a great choice, and he loved the band, and he was really a musical mentor for me through my whole life. We collaborated on a number of occasions together, and the year after he played with us at Kent, when he was leaving to go back to New York, he said, this was really great, but you have to invite me back next year and I'll bring Joe Williams with me. And we said, Clark, they don't even want us to have a band here. I don't know if we can afford to have both you and Joe Williams. And he said, well, just pay me half of what you did this time and I'll come back and bring Joe Williams. So sure enough,
he was a good friend as well.
He was a good friend as well, yeah. And he was actually one of the reasons why I ended up getting the job at the Eastman School, because I had no idea that they had a jazz program there. And at the time I was also interested in contemporary classical music, and I was a prize winner in the Gaudeamus competition for international competition for interpreters of contemporary music in Holland, and that was in '72, just before we moved to Rochester. So I was also at that time seriously considering a career as a composer in contemporary classical music and performer. But I think it was sometime in around April of it would have been '75. We got a call from Rayburn Wright, who was really the big inspiration for the beginning of the jazz degree programs at the Eastman School. He had been a trombonist in the Glenn Miller Band after the war, so Glenn Miller was not around anymore, but he was with the Glenn Miller Band for a few years and did a lot of arranging for them, played trombone. And then when he got off the band, he stayed in New York City and did freelance arranging for jazz groups, but then eventually became one of the chief arrangers at Radio City Music Hall, doing the shows for the Rockettes and directing the orchestra. And a friend of his at the Eastman School talked him into coming up to Rochester and doing a program that was called the Arranger's Holiday, a 3-week program for arrangers to study with people who really knew how to do this. And so he and Manny Album, who was one of the most important of the freelance arrangers in New York for big band stuff at that time, they came up from New York for 3 weeks every summer, and usually somewhere between 25 and 30 students would come from all over the world for these 3 weeks. And at the end of the 3-week program, they put on a concert with a guest artist, and they had a summer version of the Eastman Jazz Ensemble as the core, but then they also had a string section and woodwind players and percussion and harp from the Rochester Philharmonic, the professional orchestra in Rochester. So it was a great opportunity for people to come and try their hand in arranging, people who already had some experience. And on the concert, the students' arrangements made up the first half of the program, and then the second half featured the guests. So anyway, I got a call from Ray during the spring of '95, and he said that he wanted to fly down and talk to me about applying for this position that they had there. And the position came about actually as a result of Chuck Mangione, who had an instructor position there at the time. He decided to quit teaching and go out and try to make a success of his own music, which he did. And so that's how the position became available. And it just so happened that when they were trying to decide on the top candidates for the search, that Ray had Clark Terry as a guest soloist with the Eastman Jazz Ensemble. So when he told Clark what the job entailed and asked him if he knew anybody who he thought would be really good for it, he said Bill Dobbins. So, and we had Clark as a guest soloist several times at Eastman while Ray was still alive. And then when I ended up getting the job with the WDR Big Band, I arranged with Wolfgang Hirschman, who was the manager of the band at the time, that for my first project with the band as the new director, we would have Clark Terry as the guest soloist. So.
So a very rich career. You're working as a pianist, as a composer, as an arranger, as a conductor, as an orchestra leader. You're an author. You made a couple of books which are classic in jazz theory, in arranging and composing techniques. You did some wonderful transcription of the Monk solo recordings. We can talk about that later on. So how do you regard yourself? Is one of the fields I mentioned the most important for you, or is it all kind of a synthesis? I forgot to mention the music education part, of course, which is you've been at Eastman School of Music, but also in Colonia. I think you've been the head of the jazz department for some years. So is there any special field of activity, or is it all one?
I really enjoy it all. To me, it's just a synthesis, and I think one of the things that helped me to finally decide to concentrate on jazz as my main musical field or genre was that it seemed to me like jazz musicians, for the most part, had a kind of holistic approach to music that was very similar, interestingly, to the way music operated during the time of Bach. That at that time, all musicians had to be able to improvise because it was necessary for the musical genre that was happening then. Most of them were performers and composers. Most of them were capable of rehearsing and directing an ensemble, and most of them were involved in teaching of some kind. So in a way, it was very similar to the way many jazz people operate today. I mean, in the 30s and 40s, before music recording made its big impact on society, there was still so much work that young musicians that were interested in becoming jazz players or jazz writers, they had many opportunities to work in bands together with people that were 20 or 30 years older than they were, and that was how they learned. But I think at its best, what the jazz education field has tried to make up for or fill in a little bit is the fact that there isn't nearly so much work to perform music professionally today, because it's so easy for people to just push a button and get any kind of music they want any time of the day or night. So at its best, I think the music schools, they take on this role that used to be filled more by a sort of master-student relationship that just occurred naturally in professional groups all over the country.
So you're really also a composer, which is maybe one of the points which is not so naturally referred to jazz. What makes a good jazz composer? What is composition in the field of music, which is so much influenced by improvisation and open processes?
Well, for me, one of the main things, at least it seems to me, in terms of the most important jazz composers, I don't think there are too many exceptions to the general rule that all the great jazz composers have been, if not leading jazz soloists, at least capable jazz soloists. And for the most part, the musical vocabulary that is the vocabulary that jazz composers work with, it came originally from players. So the two aspects are related that way. Like in early jazz, even before the word swing was probably used, from people like Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet on through the so-called big band era, the first jazz developed in very spontaneous ways in small group contexts of various instrumentations, and then eventually people came along who figured out ways to orchestrate that music for larger groups, and then we had the so-called big band era. And a similar thing, I think, occurred with the later jazz styles, like when the so-called bebop style was being developed. That was developed mostly in nightclubs and jam sessions by small groups and small group musicians like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Bud Powell and so on. And then eventually people like Tad Dameron and Dizzy and Gil Fuller and other people started to learn how to orchestrate that music for large ensembles, and it seemed to continue on in a similar process that way. And then, of course, later on, I suppose during the early 40s and later, then there were jazz composers such as Duke Ellington and other people as well that began to also involve string sections and instruments that are normally associated with classical music in some of their jazz writing projects, and that's been done more and more since then.
One of the big jazz composers was Thelonious Monk.
Yeah.
You've just been part of a jury in the context of a big composition contest that was created by the Radio Symphony Orchestra in Vienna and Jam Music Lab. And the idea was to honor this great musician, the 100th birthday of him, with a composition competition that challenges to involve this creative and highly original language of Thelonious Monk with the music of nowadays, with the music of an orchestra. And what is your personal relation to Thelonious Monk? I mentioned it before. You did some great transcription work in the context of transcribing his solo pieces.
Yeah.
So what is the fascination
Well,
towards
for
Monk?
me, an interesting thing is that when we talk about musical language, in a way, I don't think it's so much that Monk has such a unique musical language. I think in his music, he's taking melodic and rhythmic and harmonic ideas that have been around earlier, and in most cases, especially the melodic and harmonic ideas have already existed in European classical music, at least a couple of generations, if not even longer, before. And one of the interesting things about Monk also, we were talking a little bit before our conversation started here about Duke Ellington, and actually the greater part of Monk's vocabulary already Duke Ellington was using before Monk had made any recordings. But I think with most of the creative composers, or improvisers for that matter, it's not so much the vocabulary that they use, but what to me makes it uniquely creative and more personal is the way they use these things. So in relation to Monk, even the way he played his own music on the piano is an important part of his musical personality, because just the fact that he played the piano in a more percussive manner and a completely different way from the swing pianists like Teddy Wilson, or even from the way Ellington played most of the time, although Ellington had done some really percussive things in a similar vein before Monk's first recordings came out. But yeah, there was an interesting story. I remember when Barry Harris visited us at the Eastman School the first time in the early 80s, he was invited by Monk to go and listen to the recording sessions when Monk did this trio record with, I think it was with Oscar Pettiford and Art Blakey, called Thelonious Monk Plays Duke Ellington.
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe it was with Max Roach, I can't remember. But anyway, Barry got to the studio quite a while before the session was supposed to start, and they had a setup with the grand piano and microphones. It was already set up for the recording, but then in another part of the studio there was an upright piano, and he noticed Monk was over there playing, and he had looked like he had some sheet music or something that was on the music rack. And when Barry listened, he said it sounded like he was doing lots of unusual stuff with the music because of the way it sounded. And when he got over to the piano and looked at what was on the music rack, it was actually just a commercial song folio of Ellington's music, and he was just playing exactly what was written in the folio. But because of the way he was playing it, it sounded like Monk.
That's interesting to know, because I think in the complete Riverside recordings they also involve this one CD of Monk playing Ellington in a trio setup, and that's it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I will hear it now with new ears.
Well, when they actually did the recording, he might have tried some different things as well, but it was interesting for Barry, because what he was actually doing before the session started was just looking at what the original versions were, just to get a starting point.
So, talking about you as a composer, since this interview also functions as a radio show, what kind of music would you like us to play and set on air? And could you tell us a little bit about the choice you made?
I think maybe as a performer, some of the things I'm most fond of, there was a series of solo recordings that I did for Advanced Music that went along with some music that I was composing between around 1992 and 2000, which they published. I did a set of preludes for piano. It ended up 4 volumes with 6 preludes in each one, and I sort of followed the routine of Bach of having one in each of the 12 major and minor keys. And they include a lot of different kinds of musical influences, from different styles of jazz to different classical influences, from earlier composers like Bach or Chopin to more early 20th century composers like Shostakovich, and even some non-Western styles of music that I was interested in various times, like Balinese gamelan music and Japanese koto music and Rhodesian ambira music. And so along with 6 of the preludes in each of the 4 CDs, I recorded 7 or 8 pieces from the jazz repertoire or the American Popular Songbook, or maybe some original tunes as well. And each of the CDs is called Preludes and Predilections. And then from more recent years, I did a project with the WDR band. I think it was around shortly after we came back, maybe around 2003. And while I was there, Peter Erskine happened to be the drummer on the project. So while I was there, I had the opportunity to make a trio recording with Peter and John Goldsby, who was the bassist in the band, and he's still playing the bass in the WDR band. And that's just called Cologne, actually.
Oh yeah.
And it's on Peter's little label called Fuzzy Music. And then a few years later, I think around 2008 or 9, when I was back in Cologne doing another project with the band, John Goldsby got us a little concert at the Steinway store there. And then we also had some time in a recording studio, so we did a duo recording on John's label, and it's called The Visit. And so it's a combination of jazz repertoire tunes, including Visitation by Paul Chambers and Nascimento by Barry Harris and other jazz tunes. And John and I each have a couple of originals on it. So those are the things I think from the recent years that, in terms of performance. Oh, unfortunately, every year I do a solo concert at the Eastman School, and I feature a particular kind of repertoire of a particular jazz composer or American songwriter. And I started putting out some solo CDs with a small label in the States called Sons of Sound, but about a little over a year ago, they went out of business. So I have a couple of CDs. I have a few of those left. So I'll actually send you one of each of those.
Because, please send it to us.
Yeah, the first one was the first volume was music of George Gershwin and Claire Fisher, and then the second one was music of Ellington and Strayhorn, and that one especially features quite a few tunes that are seldom played and are not so well known as the standard repertoire. In terms of composing and arranging, I think I'd have to say that the things I'm most happy with are things that I did with the WDR band while I was there, either as the principal conductor or projects that we've done since then. There was one CD in which Peter Erskine played drums. It's called Prism, and I actually did a book on arranging, jazz arranging and composing for the contemporary big band, which uses the music from this CD as the content. And it has 5 original compositions that are in pretty different jazz styles, and it also has 3 arrangements of Peter Erskine's tunes that I did for different projects with the band. And then in addition to that, things that get into some other areas that I've always been interested in. I was always interested in trying to do something in some music that dealt with compound meters, whether it was Indian music or East European music, but I never felt like I would be comfortable doing that just by myself, and I was always wondering if circumstances would come together where I would get to work with a soloist and composer whose music maybe I could translate to big band. So when we were living in Cologne, I got to know this saxophonist from Romania named Nicholas Simeon, and he was living in Cologne. I think he still lives there, and he asked me if I was interested in doing a project for him with the band. So we collaborated on a project where I arranged a whole program of his tunes, and he brought some soloists that had worked with him over the years too, some really interesting musical personalities. Violinist from Budapest, and a accordion player from Italy, and a percussionist from Croatia, and a drummer that he had worked with in Paris, and who lives in Paris. And so we did a record with the WDR big band called Vulcan Jazz, and I was really happy with the way that turned out. I also got an opportunity to do some projects over the years dealing with the music of Bach, and I've always enjoyed trying to do different kinds of translations of that music to different jazz or instrumentations. The one thing that I've tried to follow pretty much with that music, because it's already so great to begin with, is that I've always retained the original melodies and just put them into different rhythmic idioms. Usually the 4/4 stuff, it seemed more natural to me to do in some Latin-related idioms, because sometimes if you put them into 4/4 swing, it changes the character so much. But then it was curious, I found that with 3/4 time, that because most jazz musicians don't exaggerate the swing eighth notes so much in jazz waltzes, it was easier to do the triple meter things of Bach and do them more with the jazz feel. So one project I did with them, which didn't get released commercially, but was a lot of fun during the big Bach year, 2000, we did a project called Bach 2000 that featured the King Singers and a great saxophonist and woodwind doubler from L.A., Gary Foster. And then the later project that I did after I got to work with the King Singers, well, we also did a tribute to Billy Strayhorn with them with Art Farmer called Take the A Train. But a few years later, after I moved back to the States, I went to hear them with my wife Darlene. They performed at a small college in the Rochester area, Nazareth College, and after the concert we went back to say hello, and they told me that their management was interested in trying to do a project of music from the Bach Christmas Oratorio. So that really interested me. First of all, I wasn't really that familiar with the work, so when I found out it was a series of 6 cantatas and that it's rarely performed in its entirety, then the first thing I got a copy of the original, the Peters edition in German, and started playing through all the music, listening to classical recordings, and selecting the pieces, the big pieces, and the parts of the Christmas narrative with the evangelist and a couple of chorales, the material that would feature each of the King Singers individually, and then that would feature individual solos of the band. So it took a lot of planning, but it was well worth it. It was a great project, and it did get released under the King Singers name on the Signum Music, which is a classical label. And so it's just called the King Singers J.S. Bach Christmas Oratorio. So it was about, I guess about an hour and 45 minutes worth of music on 2 CDs. So both the band and the King Singers did an amazing job, and I was just happy to be able to do something like that and have it so well realized with the musicians.
All right. So maybe let's come back a little bit to music education. You mentioned it at the very beginning when you started to experience the field of jazz. There have been no schools or just very little schools focusing on jazz. Now we have a huge offer of all sorts of high-end education in the context of jazz. So how would you regard or judge in a way the status quo of jazz education as a field in general, and what are the most important points for you as a teacher in jazz when you work with students?
Well, I think first of all, the main reason I decided to devote most of my time to jazz education is when we were deciding whether or not to move to Rochester and join the faculty of the Eastman School of Music. I had also been considering going to New York and just starting out as a freelance musician there. And while we were living in Cleveland, we lived there for 2 years just before we moved to Rochester. They were still doing a lot of jingles and industrial films and different kinds of commercial studio work there. And so I got a chance to do a lot of that to help earn money that we needed just to pay the rent and all of that. And it was easy enough for me to do, but it wasn't music that I was really particularly interested in. So I knew that if we went to New York, and not only in the early years, but maybe for the rest of my career, I'd probably have to do quite a bit of that kind of music just to pay the bills. And the opportunity of just spending all my time on music that I really thought was great music without having to make any commercial concessions, that really appealed to me. So that was what made us decide to move to Rochester. And as I mentioned before, I think probably the best thing that jazz education can do is to provide an environment and provide some guidance, hopefully really clear and concise guidance from people who are really top-level players about how young people should go about learning this musical language, internalizing this musical language. One of the things that intrigued me about the whole idea of music as a language, when I was in college, I first heard some recordings of Indian music. This was during the period, I guess, the late 60s, when Ravi Shankar, the sitar player, first became popular in the West. And so I got a book about Indian music, just a basic one, that gave you an idea of what the history of the music was and how it was transmitted. So I read in this book that all the Indian music students, they start out with this. It's not based on so much on commercial enterprise. It's exactly the opposite. Quite. It's one master
They
and
have
one
to
student.
live with their master for quite a while.
That's right. And every at the beginning, the student listens to every note that the master plays every day, whether they're practicing or if you go to concerts of Indian music, the person who's playing the drone instrument is usually a student, either of the drummer or the melody instrument player. And everyone has to start the same way. They start by learning to sing all the ragas and recite and tap all the rhythms. So if you decide that you want to be a singer or a drummer, you're already well on your way. And then if you decide to pick another instrument, the only motivation for learning technique is to be able to put out on that instrument the language that you already speak with your hands and with your voice. So the thing that impressed me about that is that it saves all the unnecessary steps. One of the problems in the West is that people often get all kinds of virtuosic technique on an instrument, and then they have to figure out how they're supposed to make music with that.
What it's good for.
Yeah, what it's good for, exactly. So I think that's where jazz education can come in really handily and do its best work. So I think just in the same way with Indian music, I've always felt, even since I was trying to learn the music myself when I was in college, that with classical musicians, for the most part, because the discipline of improvisation gradually died somewhere in the middle of the classical period. To me, that maybe Beethoven's career in some way is a mirror of that, because there was less room for improvisation, since in Bach's time it was used in every piece. It's just that very similar actually to the earliest jazz styles, because the earliest jazz musicians were more
maybe they played variations on.
They were ornamenters.
Yeah.
You know, they would all be playing melodies that were familiar to people, but no one ever played the same melody the same way twice. And that's pretty much what happens.
Well, this was also in common for the guys in Mozart time. It was not supposed to be played. If you have a repetition, nobody would play it exactly the same time. Now,
right,
it got a little bit lost.
Yeah. And then in the classical period, in addition to that, then you had the cadenza, and ideally you were supposed to take thematic material from the movement that was just played and develop it further in a spontaneous manner. But it was interesting that Beethoven didn't write a cadenza for the first two piano concertos, but for the last three he did. So to me that was already...
Maybe he lost the faith in the interpreters.
That's what I'm thinking, that he was starting to hear some pretty weird cadenzas that instead of developing material, it was just playing lots of scales and arpeggios to make a technical display. And in some ways, I mean, I hear some of that now. That's one of the problems, in a way, that one of the things that exists to some degree in jazz now is, if you listen to a lot of the recordings of the important artists from Louis Armstrong's time up until around the mid-'60s, the uniform quality in terms of hearing some really clear melodic development and people really telling a story in the solos is pretty consistent. And yet the recordings in the last 30 or 40 years, you can find many, even by very influential artists, in which the solos often consist of really just a lot of technical display and not such a clear musical story. So in a way, I think we're in a period now in jazz that's not so much unlike the period that immediately followed the Baroque period in European music. So I would say that whatever the musical style is, whether it's closer to jazz or whether it's closer to one of the Latin idioms, or whether it's closer to some straight eighth note kind of music, whatever that is, something that schools could be really useful for us to really encourage the improvisers and the writers to try to really make sure that their improvisations and their compositions and arrangements really tell a clear story. So just use the best models you can find. I think this is the way musicians have always learned in jazz.
So Bill Dobbins, thank you very much for telling your story of becoming a musician, being a composer, a band leader, a music educator. I thank you very, very much for being here at Jam Music Lab. What are the plans for the future? I mean, our immediate future is to go to the Musikverein this night and listen to John Beasley's winner piece, Simplexity, of the Spheres of a Genius competition played by the Radio Symphony Orchestra. But after that, what are your next plans?
Well, my next immediate plans are we're going to be having, a couple of years ago, had the pleasure of collaborating for the first time with the great Panamanian pianist and composer and arranger Danilo Perez. And I've been involved in the last 2 editions of the Panama Jazz Festival, working with the big band there, working with different soloists, including Danilo, and last year Luciano Souza, this Brazilian singer. And we're having Danilo as the guest soloist with the Eastman Jazz Ensemble late November during the fall school semester. So we're going to be playing a program with the Eastman Jazz Ensemble that I arranged for Danilo, arrangements of his music. We performed this at the Ruhr Klavier Festival in Germany in the summer of 2016. So I'm happy to be able to present it to a Rochester audience with the Eastman Jazz Ensemble and featuring Danilo Perez. And I'm also planning on taking a sabbatical from teaching in the spring semester of 2019. And my main idea for that project, which I hope to begin at the end of the summer, is to write a short book on the harmonic vocabulary of Claire Fischer.
Wow.
And I would like to thank you, Marcus, for inviting me to this interview and also for involving me in this great competition, Spheres of a Genius, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the premiere of the winning piece.
You're most welcome, and I just can thank you one more time. It's great to have you here, and I hope that we might see you in Vienna soon.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.